Hi students, very good evening to one and all. I hope you are all doing well, and I have gone through my previous lecture on heteroglossia in the novel. Um, so at last we have arrived for the last lecture on this topic of discourse in the novel and the fourth part, that is heteroglossia in the novel. So let us continue where we have stopped actually. So in the previous lecture, I have told you how heteroglossia enters into the novel according to Bakhtin, where Bakhtin gives us different ways through which heteroglossia is incorporated into the novel. So he gave the examples of the English comic novel and explained how heteroglossia is incorporated through various devices like comic parodic reprocessing, and then we have these hybrid constructions, and also incorporated genres and the stylization of everyday speech, that is nothing but scars, and also the extra artistic devices, or the posited author, or it is nothing but the another or narrator. So Bakhtin has detailed that the story will always run in two levels, that is the narrators and the other is the authors. And also he has elaborated how the dialogic nature of the novel gets effective with the characters. The characters which will be having their own language, their own speech, and though we feel that the characterization is in the hands of the novelist or the author, according to Bakhtin, each of the character will carry its own language, okay, and thereby the stratification of language occurs in the novel through the, because different characters will be carrying different languages into one single novel, and of course which is being written by one author only. Though, and the characterization in the novels is very interesting. If we go into the deeper levels of this characterization, sometimes the characters outgrow the personality of the author, where the author cannot what do you say, regulate, and at times the ending is not even in the hands of the author because of the circumstances in which he will be letting the character to develop. And that is why we know so many novels, if not novels, also dramas, where we will see an open ending. So I hope you have gone through Pygmalion, where you find there is no ending to the drama. In fact, if you have read, if you didn't read, you can just Google and see what Pygmalion is. It is by G.B. Shaw. So this is how Bakhtin has explained us how the heteroglossia is being incorporated into the novel through different techniques that are used by the authors or the novelists. So now, after explaining all these, Bakhtin is continuing this part of the essay, which is like the conclusion, wherein he wants to discuss once in it is incorporated, this heteroglossia is nothing but many languages. I told you repeatedly, I have told you that it is not many languages, means not the different language varieties like English, Hindi, Telugu, etc., but these are languages within a language. So that means the internal stratification of the language, that is what Bakhtin stated. So after that is incorporated into the novel, what happens? This is the last part of this fourth part that is prescribed for you, and of course this is the last lecture also. So here heteroglossia, once incorporated into the novel, Bakhtin says, is another speech in another's language, serving to express authorial intentions but in a refracted way. So, what happens when heteroglossia enters into the novel? He is saying that it serves the purpose of the author to express his intentions not directly as we will feel it in the poetry. See, I told you in poetry what happens when we are reading lyrics or sonnets, etc. We always think that the speaker is the poet only, though we always say that we should not connect the poet with the speaker. The speaker, we should always consider that it is only a narrator for the poet. So whatever is written in the sonnet or lyric, that means whatever be the subject of that poem, we cannot connect to the author. In the similar manner in the novel also, here Bakhtin says that heteroglossia gives the freedom to the author where he can incorporate his intentions not directly but in a refracted way. So this is the advantage that the novelist will get. So according to Bakhtin, novel is very great, and of course the novel has many unique features also. So he says that it is novel is always a multiform and variform, multiform in style and variform in speech or voice. So it's very difficult to write a novel also. So but novel has the advantage of guaranteeing the author the freedom from, the freedom to reflect his intentions, though not directly, it will be indirectly reflected into the novel. That is what Bakhtin says. And further, he says that such a speech constitutes a special type of double voiced discourse. So, when heteroglossia is incorporated into the novel, what becomes is the language of the novel becomes double voiced. This is what we have already referred to, like the story operating in the two lines, that is the narrator's line and the author's line. So the this heteroglossia is what facilitates that in the novel, and that is what he says that this heteroglossia brings the double voiced ness into the language, that is double voiced discourse into the novel. And then what is this double voiced discourse? According to Bakhtin, he says that it serves two speakers at the same time. And see, when we have already learned that the story operates in two levels, that is one narrator and the other author. So we have two. So this double voice discourse, of course, serves two speakers, but at the same time, and expresses simultaneously two different intentions. So this is two different intentions are there. Um, One is the narrator's intention and the other is the author's intention. And the direct intention of the character who is speaking and the refracted intention of the author. This is what actually we have already to a little extent seen the two levels of the story operating in the novel, which of course becomes very effective because of this feature of heteroglossia. And then he says that double voice discourse is always internally dialogized. See, Bakhtin's emphasis is on dialogism, in contradiction to monologism. Monologism, as we have already discussed, is a single voicedness, which of course Bakhtin connects with the Stalinistic regime in Russia, which was a very repressive dictatorial government that was going on at that time, where no other voice is permitted. So this is the historical and social political significance behind the essay of Bakhtin is that actually Bakhtin was very fascinated by this idea of dialogism or heteroglossia, polyphony, or carnivalis. I'll be explaining that. All these are due to the repressive conditions in which he was forced to live, and then he was forced to exile also at some time of his life. So this double voiced discourse, according to Bakhtin, is always internally dialogized, and that is why it is, of course, is making the uniqueness of the novel. So why novel is different from poetry? So novel is different from poetry because, as Bakhtin elaborates, only because of the presence of heteroglossia, which is incorporated into the novel with different aspects. Okay, and then which is making the language in the novel the double voice discourse. And further in this part of the essay, he'll be explaining how the discourse in poetry is different from the discourse in the novel. Okay. Uh, double voiced internally dialogized discourse is also possible, of course, in a language system that is hermetic, pure, and unitary. A system alien to the linguistic relativism of prose consciousness. He says that a double voiced discourse is possible in the unitary system of language also. Here, he indirectly means poetry, and to some extent, he takes the rhetorical genres also. So, but he says in those systems, there is no soil to nourish the development of such discourse in the slightest meaningful or essential way. Of course, double voicedness enters into poetry or some other rhetorical genres, but Bakhtin says that though they enter, they won't find a solid ground. Uh, so to develop in that form, or even the poet or the writer who is writing any genre besides um, novel is not will not able to do or bring the double voicedness that much into those genres as it is possible for the novelist, because the novel by nature will be having a kind of language which is very heteroglottic, and this kind of language is missing in the genres of poetry and other rhetorical discourses. That is why Bakhtin says that though it may be present, it may not be dealt so effectively as it will be dealt in the novel. So he says that such poetic and rhetorical double voicedness cut off from any process of linguistic stratification. He says that poetic and rhetorical double voicedness is cut off from the linguistic stratification. See, this is very evident because when you read poem, you will find only one speaker. At the most, if it is the dramatic monologue, you will find the presence of a listener, but not never the listener speaking. So that means two people speaking in a poem we may not come across. Even if it is an epic, it is the same thing. So epic may have so many characters. Even then, behind that, one narrator or one speaker will be speaking. As you have already read Paradise Lost, book one, and so many other poems also, dramatic monologues also you have read, and though not completely a dramatic monologue, we have the example of John Donne's canonization. And then I think you might have gone through Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. Okay, and all these poems, if you recollect, you can understand very much why Bakhtin is telling that the poetic discourse is, though seems to be double voiced, may not be double voiced discourse to the extent what we find in the novel. That is his point. So, why this happens? Why poetic or other rhetorical genres are missing this double voiced discourse? According to Bakhtin, this is only because of the absence of linguistic stratification in poetry or in the rhetorical genres. They, he says that though there may be stratification, even then it leads to an individual dialogue only, according to Bakhtin. And further, individual argument and conversation between two persons, even while the exchanges in the dialogue are immanent to a single unitary language. So, in poetry, double voicedness is very superficial, means appearing on the outer side only. When we go to the inner, we may not find that. So, that is why he says that it is all unitary language. And then after dealing with the double voicedness, voiced discourse, which is not up to the mark in poetic and other rhetorical genres, he comes to the prose. He says the double voicedness one finds in prose is of another sort altogether. So, the double voicedness that is found in poetry or rhetorical genres, according to Bakhtin, is unitary. And then it is a single argument or individual argument, and it is only a dialogue between two persons, and it is only what he's saying. That it is unitary and also pure. But this is not so in prose. This is entirely different. There on the rich soil of novelistic prose. See why he is using the word prose is very clear. And when you read novels, what you find is the language of prose only. And you all know how the language of poetry is, and then how the language of prose is. Though we may draw some similarities between the two, we all know basically that the language of poetry is very different from the language of prose. So the novel will be using the language of prose only. That is why Bakhtin is stating. So when we come to the double voicedness in the language of prose, of course in the novel, in other words, he says that this draws its energy, its dialogized ambiguity, not from individual dissonances, misunderstandings, or contradictions. However, tragic, however, firmly grounded in individual destinies. So he says, as it happens in poetry, the double voiced discourse in the novel will draw its energy in a different manner. How he says, in the novel, this sinks into its roots very deeply, a fundamental socio-linguistic speech diversity and multi-languagedness. This is nothing, you know, more than what we have already seen, the stratification of language. So he says that the double voicedness of the prose is very different. And this causes in the novel, according to Bakhtin, socio-linguistic speech diversity and multi-languagedness. So multi-languagedness means the language of certain classes, the language of certain professions, or the language of certain generations, or the language of a particular group, and the language of some ideologies. So, this is how the social or internal stratification of the language occurs, and novel makes use of it. That is why the double voiced discourse even more increases when it enters into the novel. And then he says, true, even in the novel, heteroglossia is by and large always personified. how it is personified through the language of the characters. Of course, you may get a question while listening to. If it is the single voiced language of a poet, or the what we have seen, the arguments or agreements or oppositions, etc., that we could see in poetry, may come into the novel also. And that is why Bhaktin himself is noting down that you may also find such things in the novel. But he says, but such oppositions of individual wills and minds are submerged in social heteroglossia. They are reconceptualized through it. So he says, when if it is in the novel, all these oppositions or the individual wills or minds, etc., will be submerged in the social heteroglossia, and they will be reconceptualized through social heteroglossia only. Oppositions between individuals are only surface upheavals of the untamed elements in social heteroglossia. Surface manifestations elements of those elements, of course, will reveal, according to Bakhtin, in a different manner in the novel. Now, further in this part of the essay, he proceeds to say that are all novels possess heteroglossia? We may get a doubt, because Bakhtin actually coined all these terms, polyphony or dialogism and heteroglossia, with reference to Dostoevsky's novels. Dostoevsky, I told you, that is a very popular Russian novelist, and who actually wrote novels which are having social realistic novels that come under the genre, and possess this stratification of language very much, as Bakhtin observes. And I have told you to read at least a few pages of one of the popular, any one of the popular novels of Dostoevsky, and that those are available in Google. You can read just to see what is the greatness of Dostoevsky as a novelist, because Bakhtin got all the terms to bring out the uniqueness of Dostoevsky as a novelist. Of course, to some extent, that kind of qualities we'll find in Dickens. And Fielding, of course, you didn't read, I think. If you have read, you can also try to find out with reference to one of the novels that you have gone through, how whether this incorporation of genres or the incorporation of everyday language, stylization, etc., whatever compositional units that Bakhtin has stated, whether they are there in the novel which you have read already, you can just try to analyze and try to find out. And if we have any interactive session, you can share also. I advise you to read a few lines of Dostoevsky, and then whatever is the novel that you read of Dickens. And but in this essay, we know that Bakhtin has taken the example of Little Dorrit, and Little Dorrit, of course, you can read on Google also. So read and try to find out whether this heteroglossia is at work in the novel or not, as Bakhtin has stated. So when we see that the genre novel is so unique, and its uniqueness is because of the heteroglossia that is incorporated into the novel. So we'll get a doubt that whether all the novels that are written by this time will be having all these qualities. No doubt, uh, it is no. The answer to this question is without any doubt no, because we don't have we don't consider all novelists to be great. So to say that all novels will have heteroglossia. So he says that in the further part of this essay, there are novels which are not heteroglottic because there may be novelists who may not be able to catch this and incorporate the same into their novels. So that is why in page number 327, he says, if the novelist loses touch with this linguistic ground of prose style. So what is the prose style? The stratified linguistic style. That is what is the prose style. Uh, we have seen multi-languagedness, socio-linguistic. That is why in the very beginning, parts of this essay, he defined a novel as having multi-form in style and vari-form in speech and voice. So he is saying that if a novelist loses touch with this linguistic ground of prose style, if the novelist is not able to get connected with this prose style, and if he is unable to attain the heights of a relativized Galilean linguistic consciousness, that is so many, okay? If the novelist misses this, if he is deaf to organic double voicedness and to the internal dialogization of living and evolving discourse, then he will never comprehend or even realize the actual possibilities and tasks of the novel as a genre. So he says that if the novelist is not able to comprehend what is dialogism and what is a double voiced discourse and what is this, what do you say, linguistic ground, the dialogized linguistic ground in the novel, he says that, of course, he can never materialize these qualities into the novel. So he says there may be novels without heteroglossia. Or that he says that, and there may be novelists who can't listen to the fundamental heteroglossia inherent in actual language. So Bakhtin's whole theory is that language innately is dialogized. So that is what the nature of word in the third part we have seen, that is discourse in the poetry and discourse in the novel, wherein he tries to define what is the nature of word. There he concludes that a word always enters into a very elastic world of meanings, getting into contact with the other words, other situations, or other persons, etc. And he also had explained that even linguists who acknowledge the presence of a listener in the speech event. The speech event we have seen in Sajur also. So that means a speaker is there, A, B, etc. And the speech circuit of Sajur explains how the linguistic activity takes place. There also we have seen that the speech event is not monologism. For a speech event, two persons, that means die. That is why we always say dialogue, not a monologue. So in a common speech situation or speech event, we know the presence of two, that is the speaker and the listener. Thereby itself, we should realize that language is by nature dialogic and not monologic. Okay, so the novelist who could not understand the innate dialogic nature of the language, of course, cannot bring heteroglossia into the novel. And then he says, He mistakes social overtones, which create the timbers of words for irritating noises that it is his task to eliminate. So, the dialogization of the words or the language, which is inherently there, will be mistaken by the novelist to be unnecessary noise. Thereby, he will try to remove that. And the novel, when torn out of authentic linguistic speech diversity, emerges in most cases as a closet drama. So he says that if we remove the heteroglottic features from the novel, um, according to Bakhtin, it is not a novel, but it turns to be a closet drama. Okay, where detailed, fully developed, and artistically worked out stage directions are provided. You have read perhaps some dramas like Kongi's Harvest, okay, in post-colonial literature, or Derek Walcott's Dream on Monkey Mountain, and other dramas, or Harold Pinter. Okay, in all those dramas, you could have noticed the difference between the novel and a drama. So the dialogues are very much broken, and the dialogues are very simple, but you will find, especially in Kongi's Harvest, a very elaborated stage direction in the pages. So there, of course, Bakhtin is here talking about that only. If the novelist cannot understand the dialogic nature that is innate in a language, and if he writes a novel, that turns to be not a novel but only a closet drama. And further, he proceeds to say that, okay, um, again, he goes back to find out the difference between discourse in the poetry and then discourse in the what you say novel, where he says that in the discourse of poetry, though there is double voiced discourse, there prevails a kind of ambiguity. And of course, ambiguity is the very nature of poetry. You know why I'm stating like this? Because when we read poetry, we may not be able to understand poetry very easily. There itself, it is very ambiguous. We cannot come to conclusions very easily. So, there itself, you know that poetry is having some ambiguity. And also, the language of poetry, we have kind of tropes, and some kind of symbolism, some images, etc. Wherein Bakhtin already stated that this is a kind of locking of the meaning. In poetry, the meaning gets locked, unlike in the novel. So, he says there is ambiguity in the language of poetry, whereas that is not there in the language of novel. Now he says, to understand the difference between ambiguity in poetry and double voicedness in prose, it is sufficient to take any symbol and give it an ironic accent in a correspondingly appropriate context, of course. That is, to introduce into it one's own voice, to refract within it one's own fresh intention. In this process, the poetic symbol, while remaining, of course, a symbol, is at one and the same time translated into the plane of prose and becomes a double voiced word. In the space between the word and its object, another's word, another's accent intrudes. A mantle of materiality is cast over the symbol. Symbol which is there in poetry, if it enters into the prose, and if we try to um, add the irony into that, Bhaktin is stating this. There, an example he gives there. If you have the text, I think it is shared on WhatsApp. You can see there in 329 that poem is there. You can just refer to that page. The poetic symbols, he says in the stanza that is provided there. I am not reading that. You can read in the text. Are organized simultaneously at two levels. So the poet have organized the symbols at two levels. Bhaktin is stating, explaining that. That is in the semantic and expressive system, and on the level of Pushkin's speech, for whom the Gotijan gazed with its language and its poetics is merely an instantiation of the literary heteroglossia of the epoch, but one that is already becoming typical, that is a fresh tone, a fresh voice amid the multiple voices of literary language. So, like this, he says that there is some kind of ambiguity in the double voiced discourse of poetry. And further, he says that for the novelists, there is no world outside his socio heteroglot perception, and there is no language outside the heteroglot intentions that stratify that world. So, the novelist, according to Bakhtin, will never be applying the ambiguity, or a novel will never appear to be ambiguous for us, in other words. In the novel, Bakhtin says that already bespoke quality of the world is woven together with the already uttered quality of language into the unitary event of the world's heteroglot becoming in both social consciousness and language also. So he says now that the novel, the language in the novel is already heteroglottic, and it enters into a heteroglottic world of language or heteroglottic area even in the novel, if it's not so in poetry. So finally, to conclude, he says, if the art of poetry as a utopian philosophy of genres gives rise to the conception of a purely poetic extra historical language, a language far removed from the petty rounds of everyday life. See, these are the description of the poetry. It is utopian philosophy of genres, because the poetic language is not a language which we will come across in the daily life. That is why he says it is extra historical, purely poetic. And the poetic language is far removed from the petty rounds of everyday life, a language of the gods. So, whereas prose is the language of humans, poetry is the language of gods, then it must be said that the art of prose is close to a conception of languages as historically concrete and living things. So, if we define language as the language of poetry, as the language of gods, and extra historical language, a language which is away from petty rounds of everyday life, in contradiction, we have to define the language of prose as the language of everyday. And of course, as I said now, it is the language of humans. And it is not extra historical, but historical. And he says historically concrete and living things. It is the language of the living things. The prose art presumes a deliberate feeling for the historical and social concreteness of living discourse. So, according to Bakhtin, the prose art means prose writing presumes a deliberate feeling for the historical and social concreteness of a living discourse. So, prose considers language as a living discourse as well as its relativity. So, the discourse in relation to other matters. A feeling for its participation in historical becoming and in a social struggle. So, of course, a discourse is always there in a social struggle and in history. It deals with discourse that is still warm from that struggle and hostility, as yet unresolved and still fraught with hostile intentions and accents. In a way, he says that in poetry, language gets locked, and of course, it is to some extent not dynamic, in other words, dead. But in contradiction, the language of prose is very dynamic. Uh, Historically, of course, socially also. And he says it is still warm. So that means what? They generally we have seen in Aristotle's Poetics the mean. What is that? The mean, the concept of mean. Okay, mean is having a certain kind of temperature, or to some extent only everything is good. The principle of mean. Okay, we have seen. So the our temperatures, as I told you, is we have a scale like 98.6 etc. And then if it is lower also it's not good, if it is higher it is not good, we know that. And that is why Aristotle proposes there is a kind of mean principle in everything, not and of course the mean principle is drawn from the medical analogy or medical metaphor of catharsis. So where the mean principle is is what guarantees the life in organisms. So like that he is saying, Bhaktin is saying that discourse is always living. We may think that what is this living or organic, as already Bhaktin used this organic double voiced discourse. So we will be wondering what is this living feature in the language, because the language, as far as our knowledge goes, is like a tool for communication. That is what I always tell you, that what we have learned already, we should unlearn the things. So we should not consider language as a mere tool of communication as other people do. For us, especially the students of literature, language is always alive and it is very dynamic and it's a living thing. And if we go to structuralism, it is to our astonishment that we know that we are in the hands of language. It is not that we are using the language, but language is what shaping our world, that So here he says that whatever lively features that we are having in a language are visible in what you call prose, in other words novel. So that is why he says where the poetic language gets the meaning locked, and it is ambiguous. Okay, and it will not allow the language to live in it. It is uh, of course away from the everyday language etc. and extra historical. But when you come to the prose, the discourse is very historical, social, and it is warm. And he says that when a word is released, it enters into a dialogized world, a world of struggle, a world of hostility. And as it unresolved and still fraught with hostile intentions and accents. See, according to post structuralist theory, there is no end for meanings. That is the characteristic of null. Now, this is called as difference. Okay, there is no end for meanings, and Derrida, one of the post-structuralist thinkers, critics, literary theoretician, he says that it is like what do you call? Mm, a cloth, a cloth that is fabric, the fabric that is unfurled, whose other end is not visible. So meaning is like that. So for the novels it is like that. Maybe for poetry we may think that meaning after some extent may not get extended, but for the novels, as we have seen, the theories of Bakhtin may not get locked at any time. The meaning may not get locked at any time because by nature the novels are heteroglottic. So a very big essay. This is Discourse in the novel, and we have two more parts which are even more important also. That is, one is the speaker in the novel, and two lines of development in the European novel, etc. Those two we did not prescribe uh, because we need more time to finish this. And moreover, these three parts, three big parts with the introduction, are revealing three important aspects that of novel, regarding novel, as we have already discussed. I think the second part, that is the discourse, no, the third part, that is in the discourse in poetry and the discourse in the novel, I did not dealt very completely because the whole part, is as I have already told you in the introductory part, Bakhtin's essays style of writing is very repetitive, and at times it is very confusing, because he'll be dealing with the same point again and again, more elaboratory. So the third part of this essay is like that. That is why I didn't dwell more into that. More important of all the four parts is this, that is heteroglossia in the novel. So by this time you might have understood what is heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is different languages within a language, that is the internal stratification of the language, which is the concept of Bakhtin. So I hope you have been listening to the lectures, and you understood something about the discursive nature of the novel, that we have to say. So novel is more discursive than poetry, according to Bakhtin. And what is the uniqueness of the novel, compositional units, etc. In fact, if you understand this essay, you can analyze a novel even more effectively than you were doing till now, because you have been reading novels, and you will read novels, and if you want to go into the research areas also, it will be of good use to you to read it. Again, you have to read it very deeply with the lectures that I have given. Here and there in the essay, you will get repetitive passages, which are very confusing also. You need not worry about all those. Try to listen to my lectures and take down, you try to write down some points, which out of which you can make an essay to write. Okay, coming to the possible questions that can be asked, each part can be one question, and then when come to short answers, you have the short answers that we have discussed, like polyphony, dialogism, monologism, heteroglossia, okay, or stylistics as such, can be short answers for you. Okay. So with this, I am concluding this essay, Discourse in the Novel. One more topic of Bakhtin is there, that is carnivalesque. I will explain you later. It's a small feature only, which is derived from the carnival, which is the modern days carnivals in America, where a kind of like our jataras, okay, will be celebrating with much noise, pomp, and glory, etc. So from that he derived a carnivalesque, and the carnival will present a subversion, a concept of subversion. So we'll see that some other day, not now. So after this, I'll be going to the next essay. Before this, um, I feel it is better if you can join one online class, if all of you can join online class, so that we will discuss your specialization part also. Okay. Have a nice time. Bye.